thank you all for having me. Thank you, Professor Vitale, for the wonderful introduction. Very good to be here. So I have a few things to say about rhetoric and memory, and then maybe there would be some questions or we can talk about. So I'll just get started. I'll begin by suggesting that ours is an age of conflict. And I don't think many people today would disagree that the world is marked by a lot of turmoil and conflict, whether in Hong Kong or in Venezuela or in my own country, the United States. We are at a moment where in Beirut, the world is marked by a lot of turmoil and conflict. And a remarkable number of those conflicts, whether local, regional, national, or global, are ultimately conflicts about, or disagreements about, our shared past. Scholars of public memory, of course, have long acknowledged that one of the aspects of memory is that it's very dynamic, and it's full of conflict. So what I remember may be different than what you remember. So memory itself is a kind of fluid concept with lots of differences and conflicts. But I'd like to suggest that the urgency and consequences of that conflict has been very serious over the last several decades. So let me give you a few global examples just to prove my point. In Turkey, the Turkish government has gone to great lengths to deny the existence of the Armenian genocide. And if you don't know, beginning around 1915, the Ottoman Turkish government exterminated some 1.5 million Armenians and caused millions more to flee the country. And there's ongoing political struggle to push the Turkish government to acknowledge, to recognize the 1915 events as genocide. But the Turkish government maintains that the million-plus deaths were actually the result of only the First World War and influenza. The Turkish government has created pamphlets, websites, various presentations by government offices, all to craft a narrative of the historical events that erase the Armenian genocide from existence. The Turkish government is trying, in other words, to rewrite global history. More dramatically, the Turkish government has used law, the Article 301 of the Penal Code on insulting Turkey. There's actually a law against insulting Turkey. And they have used this law to prosecute people who bring up the Armenian genocide, including the Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk. Now, since I'm American, I spend a lot of my time apologizing for America. So I'll begin by saying I'm sorry. But in my home country, we have also these conflicts over public memory. The past few years, you might have seen, have had numerous, even deadly protests related to the presence of Confederate Civil War monuments in southern cities throughout the United States. Indeed, over 100 monuments commemorating the Confederate Civil War soldiers have been removed, but thousands remain, and there are even some organizations who have mobilized to defend the existence of these monuments in public space. They say the Civil War happened, these Confederate soldiers existed, you cannot erase history. Others, of course, have objected to the existence of public monuments commemorating Civil War soldiers because the rebellious region in the United States was not just about seceding from the United States, it was really about maintaining a system of slavery. And so for many Americans, the presence of Confederate Civil War monuments is a way of trying to justify the keeping of human beings in bondage. So in places like Charlottesville, Virginia, New Orleans, Louisiana, and even Austin, Texas, my home state, some have suggested that these monuments are validation of the racism that was the basis of the Civil War. Others insist that the monuments are justified because the history exists. In other words, the historical facts justify the monuments that commemorate. One more example. In Poland, the Polish government recently amended the law on Institute of National Remembrance to make it illegal to attribute blame for the crimes of the Holocaust to the government or people of Poland. They've made it illegal. As Deputy Justice Minister Patrick Jaki contended, quote, "We have to send a clear signal to the world that we will not allow for Poland to continue to be insulted." Critics of this law, of course, have raised concerns about the way the Polish government is seeking to control the historical narrative of the nation's past. As Tara John reports for the BBC, the proposed legislation raises the concern among critics about how the Polish state will decide what it considers to be historical fact. So each of these examples suggests the broader importance of our remembrance of the past has even today. Which events get remembered, how they are interpreted, what values we attribute to them, and ultimately the question of how our disputes about the past get resolved. I think each of these examples also highlights a persistent theme in the struggles over public memory, namely a sense of tension between our narratives or our accounts of public memory on the one hand, the stories we tell, and this sense of there being historical facts on the other side. This question of fact versus opinion has become increasingly prominent in global discussions about memory and politics. In fact, so much so that in my home country, the United States, we have coined the term fake news. Everybody's heard that phrase spoken by people in the United States. It's meant to say, yes, you have a story, but the facts are separate. That's fake news. So in my few moments with you this evening, I want to suggest that the Western rhetorical tradition can provide useful ways of thinking about the relationship between rhetoric and memory, and indeed that in the classical rhetorical tradition, the idea of rhetoric and memory are deeply interrelated. More to the present point, I also want to suggest that the classical rhetorical tradition provides ways of thinking about how we seek to justify our claims about the past and the complex relationship between our narratives of the past on the one hand and the facts of the past on the other. So to pursue this, I want to begin by noting some of the interconnections between memory and rhetoric in ancient Greek thought. I then want to delve a little bit deeper into Aristotle's notion of proofs and the way those relate to both memory and rhetoric. And then in the end, I want to get a concrete example, because I feel like concrete examples make things a little easier to understand. So let's start with the classical tradition. Nothing like starting with the Greeks and Romans, right? It's a beautiful Romanesque building. I think we have the Romanesque floors in the bottom, so I'm pleased to invoke the Romans, since this was apparently an outpost of the Roman Empire. It's just very distant. So typically when we think of memory in the classical tradition, we think of the Romans. It was, after all, the Romans who instituted the 5 canons of rhetoric. Surely my rhetoric students know the 5 canons of rhetoric. Memoria was one of those, along with invention, organization or dispositio, style, and delivery, pronunciatio, right? In this schema, memoria or memory was often understood in relation to sophisticated systems of remembering arguments and pieces of evidence. And so anyone who studied the Roman interest in rhetoric and memory will know they devised all kinds of elaborate systems, like this memory palace, mnemonic devices to help you remember all kinds of pieces of information and ideas you would create. Do you know the story? The Romans said, create in your head a palace with different rooms, and in each room put the thing you want to remember. And then you'll be able to go back in your mind to that place where you left the thing, and you'll be able to remember. And in fact, these mnemonic devices were quite the obsession of philosophers throughout the Roman into the Renaissance. Philosophers wanted to figure out what's a good way to help you remember. My wife wishes I had a good way to remember. I'd like to suggest, however, all that concern about systems for remembering have their roots in a deeper, and I'll suggest more interesting, ancient concern about memory, namely that memory could be dangerous. Plato certainly thought so. You may recall, if you've read your Plato, that in the Theaetetus, Plato offers the metaphor that memory is like an impression left in wax. So if you think of the rack with the rings pushed into a wax. So memory is like that. And here's the key point. When we remember, we are not remembering the actual event. Rather, we are remembering the impression it left on us. So just as with the metaphor of the wax, the ring or the signet that made the impression is gone, what we have instead is the impression it left. And so Plato said our experiences do the same thing to us. They leave impressions on our soul. And the soul is like a ball of wax for Plato. And every impression leaves an impression, a little indent. And when we remember, we're trying to conjure up images in that impression. In other words, in that space of absence, we're trying to conjure back the experience that left that feeling. Indeed, Plato argued that the empty space is not only the empty space of conjuring memory, but here's what made Plato anxious. That same empty space was where we conjure fantasy and fiction. For Plato, the capacity to remember and the capacity to imagine things that had never happened were the exact same capacity. So when you dream, when you daydream, when you fantasy, or when you remember, for Plato, these were all the same capacity. And of course, for Plato, this was very dangerous. Because if our memory could be like fantasy, then the ability to remember is also the ability to misremember, to remember wrongly. And indeed, in the Theaetetus, Plato is concerned that the fallibility of memory can lead us to what he calls other judging, to judge wrongly, to think this was true when in fact it was not true. For Plato, and especially for his student Aristotle, the danger of judging wrongly, of misremembering, required a careful and systematic approach to remembering the past. And it was from this anxiety that we might remember wrongly, that all of the systems for improving memory were built. Because if we wanted to know truth, then we had to remember accurately. To misremember would push us away from truth. Now, my students of rhetoric, this should sound familiar, because these are the exact same concerns that Plato had about rhetoric. It was, you'll recall, the capacity of eloquent speakers like Protagoras or Gorgias, their ability to enchant audiences, to draw them to what philosophers felt were false judgments. That was the heart of Plato's condemnation of rhetoric in his early dialogues. Rhetorical appeals, in other words, are like false memories. They could lead people to judge wrongly. And even more to the point, both rhetoric and memory work in the same way. Because isn't rhetoric an art of conjuring images before an audience so that they are persuaded or convinced? So for Plato, the ability to remember, the ability to imagine, and the ability to persuade all come from the same root capability. At the heart, then, of both rhetoric and memory, these are exercises of speculation, of conjuring before an audience speculative fantasies the audience feels is compelling and thus willing to believe. The same concern about rhetoric is also evident in Plato's later efforts, the Phaedrus, where Plato sought to construct a noble rhetoric, a worthwhile, a good rhetoric. And a good rhetoric was one grounded not in just the capacity to persuade people, but a good rhetoric was founded on the capacity to amplify truth. So that rhetoric was kind of a servant of philosophy, where philosophy found the truth, and rhetoric's job was to spread that to the masses. And of course, that is indeed what most of the classical traditions of rhetoric did. They focused on attempting to somehow ground our capacity to persuade in something greater, in philosophy, in truth, in ethics. Whether it was Aristotle's declaration that rhetoric was the antistrophos, you know this, right? Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. Dialectic finds truth. Rhetoric is its counterpart, amplifies that truth. Or Quintilian, we'll get to the Romans again, always back to the Romans. Quintilian, who said the art of rhetoric is the art of a good ethical person speaking well, so that ethics becomes part of the founding of rhetoric. Much of the classical tradition was devoted, here becomes the key part, much of the classical tradition was devoted to disciplining the capacity to persuade. Undisciplined rhetoric was too dangerous. So rhetoric needed to be disciplined. And of course, the same is true of memory. For Aristotle, turning the unruly power of persuasion into discipline was through anchoring persuasion in what he called proofs. Rhetoric was an art for Aristotle of observing in any given situation the available means of persuasion. And for Aristotle, these means of persuasion were understood to be proofs. Right? Now, as most students of rhetoric will recall, my good students of rhetoric, you will recall, Aristotle thought there were two broad types of proofs. One type we call artistic, the other we call inartistic, or at least in English. Artistic proofs, or intechnic, are the proofs that we invent, that we create, that we speak. They are whatever can be prepared by method or by us. So as a speaker, my job as I listen, as I look at you, as I prepare this talk, as I now give it to you, is to say, what can I do to better persuade you, to better convince you of my argument? Those are intechnic or artistic proofs. Can I make my story more compelling? Can I say it in a way that will be clearer to you? Those are all artistic choices I, as a rhetor, make. And of course, students of rhetoric will know logos, ethos, pathos. Perfecto. Check. Logos, logic, the soundness of the account. Pathos, the leading people to emotional response. And ethos, character, my demonstration of my character. Wow. A+. Go for it. Inartistic proofs, which Aristotle doesn't say that much about, are those proofs that are pre-existent. They exist outside of the individual rhetor's construction. As a speaker, in other words, we invent our artistic proofs, logos, pathos, ethos, and we discover the inartistic proofs outside and bring them into our invention. Now, it's worth pausing here to consider the similarity of this distinction between artistic or invented proofs, what I can say, and the inartistic, those that exist outside of my saying, and how similar that is to the discussion about the contests over memory. Many of the conflicts of the past, I suggest, entail a struggle between our narratives about the past, the story we tell, and what at least some people assert to be the facts of the past. Now, as noted in my home country, the United States, this conflict has come to cluster around that term fake news, in which each side in a dispute claims to be on the side of facts, while accusing the other side of being just narrative, just account. Or, to put it back into the Aristotelian frame, people claim the epistemological superiority of inartistic proofs and accuse you of the lowly artistic proofs. This is creating a chaotic struggle about what counts as true. As my old friend, philosopher Henry Drew says, we're now facing a crisis of memory, agency, and culture. And I'd like to suggest, at its roots of this crisis about what gets to count as true and what counts as just opinion, is the question of both public memory and of rhetoric. The current crisis of memory, I'll suggest, seems to be driven, at least in part, by the ways each side of a conflict tries to claim fact as a kind of epistemological superiority. You have your story, but I have the facts. However, if we return to Aristotle, we find that such a hard-line distinction between fact and opinion, or fact and narrative, is not really tenable. As Michael Gagarin, the classicist, notes, the term for inartistic proofs should not really be translated as evidence, but as evidentiary material. As he notes, a pre-existing fact or material is not in and of itself proof. A historical fact is not proof. It is material that can be incorporated into an artistic rhetorical case. Indeed, as Gagarin argues, the persuasive power of either artistic or inartistic proofs are virtually indistinguishable in that both rely on the capacity of the speaker to weave them into a persuasive case. Facts themselves cannot be persuasive. Only rhetorical accounts can be persuasive. In this way, the inartistic proofs are not so much prior conditions around which a rhetor must navigate, but they are material that the rhetor draws on to construct their case. There is no hint, Gagarin tells us, that inartistic proofs are prior to artistic proofs. They are simply different material the speaker can draw on to make their case. As my friends Richard Enos and Janice Lauer, American rhetorical scholars, note, the speaker creates meaning by advancing both evidentiary and artistic proofs as well as by inventing new proofs, and in weaving those together seeks to create an account that is compelling to an audience. In terms of their persuasive capacity to craft messages and shape worldviews, inartistic and artistic proofs can be understood as virtually identical. So if we return to the debates about the past, debates about public memory, the claims about the epistemological advantage of having the facts, in this way is untenable. Now this is not, to be clear, to deny that there are facts. There are facts. I will grant it. It's true. There are facts. But facts do not persuade. The existence of facts are not persuasive. Facts do not lead to judgment. Only rhetoric leads to judgment. Facts, in other words, cannot speak for themselves. They can only be invoked by a person who uses them to lead an audience to judgment. Thus, the crucial insight at this point from Aristotle is that facts only have persuasive power through the way they are selected, framed, and presented by the rhetoric. It is through rhetoric that facts gain their persuasive capacity. So if we return to my global examples from Turkey, from the United States, from Poland, we now see them as not contests over the facts about the past, but contests over what evidentiary material is selected, and moreover, claims about the materials they have selected and what becomes the defining fact of the past. These efforts then about the past become a way of shaping the deliberative effort. And what I find disturbing is not that there are deliberations about the past, but efforts to stop deliberations about the past. In the United States, efforts to deliberate about the meaning of the past have met with violence and include deadly violence. In Turkey, the government has shown a willingness to use the law to prosecute people for telling a different story of the past. And in arguably the most egregious example, the Polish government has made it illegal to offer an interpretation of the past different than the government's own interpretation. Because efforts to set the facts in stone stop the rhetorical deliberative process. And no culture can stop the rhetorical process. So thus far, my main point, let's see if it's been clear, has been about the not trying to privilege inartistic facts, proof over artistic facts. Facts are not in and of themselves persuasive. You should not claim the moral superiority of having the facts. You create superiority by having a better rhetorical account. And indeed, I'd like to suggest that it's not just important that you have an account, but it's important that the process of deliberation be ongoing. In addition to the importance of deliberation for a democratic culture, I'd suggest that memory itself will not be stopped. Memory is remarkably fluid and dynamic. Our attempts to write the past into stone, literally, into stone, to try to fix memory so that it will not change. Not only that things will not be forgotten, but they will not be remembered differently. Every cultural effort to create a memory that will not change has failed. memory will not be fixed. Memory cannot be stopped. It is not only epistemologically impossible, but politically misguided. Given the inevitable and unstable nature of memory, I know this slide too long, clearly. Aristotle. All right, I'm going to move to another time, I promise. Memory will not simply be contained. It can't stop. Memory will change. And the heart of a vibrant, effective democratic culture is that we are engaged in the process of changing that memory. We don't try to lock it. But in the last part of my talk, I want to shift gears. I actually want to turn the direction of it. Most of us in rhetoric would be happy to tell you that artistic proofs are good because that's what we teach. So, of course, as Socrates himself said, it is easy to praise Athenians in Athens. Just like if I come here and I say, isn't Argentina great? Aren't the football teams in Argentina great?
Yeah.
That's easy, right? You all agree with that.
Sure.
If I come here and say, isn't Brazil great? You're probably going to disagree.
No.
That would cause me some trouble. I got you. I got it, right? So it's easy for me to come to rhetoric students and say rhetoric is important. It's easy for me to come to rhetorical groups and say artistic proofs are important. But I also want to suggest that there's a real, more vibrant role for inartistic proofs, for the kind of evidence that we uncover through lands. And so in the last part of my talk, I want to think a little bit about the importance of the rhetorical dynamic of inartistic proof, of actual, simple material. Because as recent scholarship developing in the US and other places is starting to suggest, these objects, the facts, the material, has a kind of rhetorical agency. And moreover, I'd like to suggest that the agency, the power of a material object, the inartistic proof, is particularly evident during times of turmoil and trauma. Trauma, as scholars like Kathy Kruth have argued, represents a substantial challenge to both memory and rhetoric. In much contemporary trauma theory, traumatic events are understood as a kind of rupture that entails both a rupturing of one's memory, but also a rupturing of one's very sense of self. French psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva, for instance, conceives of trauma as a kind of shattering of the psyche. An American rhetorical scholar, Claire Cisco-King, suggests trauma entails a sense of one's perspective being torn apart and shattered. Thus, the problem of memory in relation to trauma is that the event is so profoundly rupturing. The trauma is such a rupturing event that it makes not only a coherent recollection difficult, but it even poses a threat to the person trying to remember. Traumatic memories thus rarely emerge as coherent or persuasive artistic accounts, but rather traumatic memories often come back in fragments and glimpses of an event that has proved so profoundly damaging to the person. The rhetorical conundrum of trauma is captured by the way many scholars define traumatic experience as incomprehensible, as unspeakable, as Kathy Kruth puts it, as an impossible saying. It is impossible to tell the story of trauma because of the nature of the event. Or if we go back to reframe trauma theory into the Aristotelian frame, we might contend that the traumatic event proves resistant to artistic proofs, and that trauma not only ruptures the speaker's coherent experience, but also constitutes damage to the speaker's very psyche. If we return to Plato's wax metaphor, remember the impression left in wax, we could say that where normal memories leave an impression in our soul, traumatic memories puncture, tear the soul. And in this way, leave the space for an artistic remembrance, jagged and fragmented. But if trauma is a wound leaves a scar. While we often think of the scars of trauma as ephemeral, as psychic, as cultural, they also manifest in the world as actual damage, as eyewitness accounts, as testimonies, as confessions. Thus, the scars of trauma constitute a useful remnant a residue of the traumatic event, and one that can be part of our memory of the past. Or to put it back into the Aristotelian frame, the scar provides inartistic proof, evidentiary material that can be crafted into a rhetorical account. So in the final section of my talk, I want to think a little bit about the role of inartistic proofs, particularly as they play a role after trauma. Now, to be clear, I'm still not saying the facts are more important. It's not more important. I'm important. It's important. But rather, I want to think about the way that actual evidentiary stuff, actual evidentiary material, inartistic proof, can become part of, can actually serve the inventional process of rhetoric after trauma. I want to think about the role of inartistic proof in the rhetorical reconstruction of public memory after a traumatic event. And I'd like to do this by getting down to a real-world example. I always love a quote by Kevin O'Neill and Alexander Hinton, who study genocide. And they say, look, you scholars, you make distinctions between truth and memory and representation, but on the ground, all those distinctions start to go away. So too, I'd like to suggest the distinction between inartistic proofs and artistic proofs also blur in the actual process of recalling memories and crafting public accounts of the traumatic past. So I want to talk about a real-world example. And I want to take you with me to my hometown of Syracuse, New York. Now I should say, if this was an accurate picture, it would be snowing. Because it is almost always snowing in Syracuse. I found one day when it was not snowing, and that's the picture you get. The city of Syracuse on beautiful Lake Onondaga was incorporated in 1825, and for much of its early history, the center part of the city, the very sort of central area here, served as the neighborhood for the working class, the poor, and for immigrants. So when immigrants came to Syracuse, they didn't get to live by the lake, they got to live in this sort of central lowland area. The area was known as the 15th Ward, and it was, up until the Second World War, the only place where Jewish residents could live in the city of Syracuse. If you were a Jewish family in Syracuse, this was the only place you could live. You were not allowed to live. People wouldn't sell to you in other places. They wouldn't rent to you in other places. After the Second World War, blatant anti-Semitism was less socially acceptable because of the whole Nazi thing. And so Jewish families began to be able to move out of the 15th Ward. But as they moved out, another population moved in, African Americans. African Americans who were drawn from the South up north, the promise of jobs, the promise of less racism, or less explicit racism, began to settle into Syracuse, which at the time was a kind of industrial town. Lots of factories. And so soon African Americans were filling the pot area of the 15th Ward, which continued to be a sort of working class neighborhood. And the population increased throughout the late 40s into the 1950s with a mix of Jewish, African American, and other immigrant populations all living in this neighborhood known as the 15th Ward until upper and middle class white folks started getting nervous about having all this new African American population moving into the center of the city. There's a picture. That's what the neighborhood used to be. Keep that in mind. I'll show you a more recent picture. Right. That's what the neighborhood is. This was the 15th Ward. This was full of churches and synagogues and bars and jazz clubs and schools and all the things that make a neighborhood. But because there were suddenly a lot of African Americans moving in, the white people got nervous and they started having headlines like this: 15th Ward, keg of dynamite. You can see in the illustration, migrant labor. That means African American. That's not just migrant. That's black migrant labor. Pouring into this cauldron, getting ready to explode. Modern ghetto threat to peace and progress. So there was a lot of anxiety around the 15th Ward. And there was a growing political movement in the city of Syracuse to get rid of this center city scene. And in the mid-1950s, the city of Syracuse found a path forward through a federal program called urban renewal. In the 1950s, the U.S. federal government, the national government, sponsored a program nationwide that promised to renovate, to fix up all the decaying inner city slums of America's cities. In Syracuse, and indeed in almost all of the United States, the federal dollars that were promised to rebuild the neighborhood were used for other purposes. The promise was simply not fulfilled. It was a lie. In Syracuse, around 1955, the plan to renovate the 15th Ward was replaced with a twofold plan. On one hand, a medical hospital complex was given more land, houses torn down to expand the hospital, and for the most part, that was okay. Hospitals, we like hospitals, that's good. On the other side, and by far the biggest blow to the 15th Ward, was the plan to run U.S. Interstate Highway 81 right through the center of the city. And that is the picture I showed you. So by the early 1960s, what had been the working class neighborhood of the 15th Ward was almost entirely gone. Hospital buildings on one side, the enormous interstate overpass on the other. Now the residents of the 15th Ward had been promised new housing, new resources, public amenities. They had one choice: move, leave. Now, for the few who owned their homes, and some did, they were compensated. The government bought their homes. But for the vast majority, especially the African Americans who were just renting, did not own their home, they were given $25, which I think I calculated was like, 800 pesos? I can't remember, I looked it up the other day. About 800 pesos, and told, move. There was no relocation, there was no plan, there was simply, the interstate is coming, you have to go. So the communities who had resided, some for many generations, in the city's central district, were scattered across the city's other low-income areas. Some went to the decaying houses of the south side of the city, others went to the equally decaying houses on the west side of the city. Crucially, all the things that make a neighborhood, the formal social structures, the informal structures, the churches, the community centers, the family relationships, the social organizations, were all scattered around the edge of the 15th Ward. So by the time you get to the 1960s, the 15th Ward is gone. Barely a trace. Now this experience was, to return to the key point, traumatic. In a period of just a few short years, everything that had made the 15th Ward a neighborhood and a community was uprooted and dispersed. Psychiatrist Mindy Fullilove describes the experience of such upheaval on a community as root shock. A term may seem odd, but if I have any gardeners here, anybody garden? So my gardeners will know if I grab a plant and just pull it up and I plant it somewhere else, odds are it's going to die. Right? Because it lost all its local soil. It was ripped up. And in America, in English at least, we call that phenomena root shock. The root was shocked. Couldn't adapt. Couldn't figure out its movement. Fullilove says the same thing happens to displaced communities, where everything that made a community, everything that made us, is suddenly ripped apart. And people don't know where to go. She argues, root shock undermines trust. It increases anxiety, destabilizes relationships, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and indeed increases risks of every kind of stress-related death. Root shock is devastating. So I entered the scene almost exactly 50 years after the 15th Ward began being destroyed. This is what it looked like when I moved here. You see the snow? Truth in advertising. That's what it is. At the anniversary of the beginning of the end of the 15th Ward, I was asked with a group of students by a local church that had somehow survived the uprooting of the 15th Ward to help them commemorate the end of the community. This began with the plan of it being a 15-week project. Do you have semesters here?
Yes.
So about 15 weeks? Yeah, so that was the
Yes,
plan.
exactly.
15 weeks. Just about one semester. Began in final exam, gotta go. For me, it lasted for 8 years. And it went on much longer for other individuals and organizations. The reason it continues for so long, some 8 years of doing this memory project, was that the trauma of 1955 was still very alive in the city of Syracuse. We found that as we worked to bring forward the accounts, testimonies, photographs, archives, artifacts of the 15th Ward, that those accounts, objects demanded we go further. Every story we heard led us to another story. Every photograph to another photograph. Returning to the main point of this example then, not just a history of Syracuse, we were involved in a rhetorical effort to artistically invent the 15th Ward that no longer existed. And what we had to go on were all of the inartistic elements, testimonies, photographs, maps, witness accounts. But these testimonies and objects, and this becomes the real key point, all these objects, all these people, all these photographs and maps and buildings, they were not just evidentiary material. They called us forward. They called us forward to look for more, to uncover more, to find more, to map more. But it was not only the accounts and testimonies and photographs that called us to continue to deepen the project. I would suggest the very city streets called for us to account for. The missing buildings, the repurposed delis, the nightclubs, all urged us to recognize the place where they once stood, the place where a community had once been. As we pursued the project, the city itself seemed almost haunted with the spirits of those structures and organizations that had once lived and thrived in the spaces now occupied by parking lots and support buildings. So we spent time marking these locations. We spent time organizing community activities to acknowledge them. We spent time recalling them into existence and the remnants of what had been, to try to help these inartistic elements to speak. As we did so, the city itself, that inartistic material left behind, became an active participant in not only our research, but in calling forth the rhetorical reconstruction of a memory long erased. What we now recognize as the physical scars left on our city by urban renewal demanded that the traumatic wound of the city's upheaval be recognized, that its story be told. As Spanish historian Joan Ramon Racina contends, the traces left by the past in the form of social relations continue to have influence on the environment, on forces and currents that modify both what is remembered and the range and strength of its after effects. That these objects left behind continue to have effect. And I say we should not underestimate the power of these traces. Of course, recognizing a lost spirit does not bring it back to life. So I wish I could tell you that we revived the 15th Ward. The 15th Ward looks very much today as it does in these photographs. But what we did do was work with the remnants of that community to recall it and to recall that community. Its residents, its organizations, its relations, its building, its streets, all those things that had disappeared, we tried to call back the existence at least of their absence. We were able then to at least recast the narrative the city of Syracuse told about itself to its city. And now, as a coda to the story, we'll add on, that memory is becoming relevant once again. That interstate bridge through the center of Syracuse is, as this picture suggests, coming to the end of its life. That interstate is not going to last much longer. 50 years, it's starting to. And so the city of Syracuse is engaged in a debate about what should be done. Should it be simply replaced or rerouted? What should be done with that land where this bridge now sits. And as this debate is happening, people are returning to the 15th Ward. So this headline, I-81 highway robbery, the razing, the destruction of Syracuse's 15th Ward. Or here, in a magazine called The Atlantic, how to decimate a city, the story of Syracuse's 15th Ward. All of this attention back, suggesting that the memory of the 15th Ward is not just about the past, but it actually serves as a rhetorical resource for the present. As a wonderful scholar, Alejandra Vitale, I don't know if you've heard of her, she's wonderful, somewhere in Buenos Aires, has suggested the memories of this old neighborhood have become what she calls rhetorical argumentative memories. And they provide for us in the present a return and reformulation of persuasive strategies used in the past to rally people around an issue. These memories are becoming rhetorical resources for people that want to see the city go in a different direction, who want to, as this Washington Post article suggests, not simply reroute the road, but think about reparations. What should be done to account for the damage done to the communities of the city by this highway? The memory of an old, vibrant, but now lost community has called some in the city to propose revitalizing the space, and while there is no way to recreate the community that was traumatically torn apart, there is hope that the city can learn from its past and at least honor the memory of that lost community. So for the ancients, the fluidity of memory was frightening. The prospects that memory could shift, of how we account for the past could change, that was frightening. Things might be forgotten, things might be misremembered, might be remembered differently. And indeed, I think we can see a similar kind of anxiety operating around the very idea of rhetoric. And indeed, beyond the Greco-Roman world, we can actually note that everywhere in the world we had similar anxiety about things being forgotten or misremembered. That's why we have pyramids, that's why we have statues, that's why we have, I've walked around your beautiful city, every corner I go to has another statue of some famous person, I don't know who they are, but they're famous, and they will be remembered because there's a statue of those people. People didn't want those people to be forgotten. And more importantly, it's not just we didn't want them to be forgotten, we didn't want them to be remembered differently. We wanted them to be remembered as we cast them in the story. So thought of in this way, we can see memory not simply as an orientation to some event of the past, but memory is an action, a process by which we seek to reassemble elements and fragments of our past into something that seems like a coherent account of that past. It's a useful truism in the study of public memory to point out that memory always functions in the present, the person remembering now. When I remember, it is not in the past. When I remember, it is not for the past. When I remember, it is now, and it is always for a present purpose. It's worth recalling here the Latin roots of remember, memor, which is to be mindful, and rememori, which is to call to mind. When we remember, we are acting to call to mind fragments of our past impressions, and then importantly, to transform those fragments into a coherent account, a persuasive account that explains that past event. This transformation, as I've tried to argue, is essentially rhetorical. Just as memory is an act of calling forth an account of the past, so too rhetoric is an act of inventing an account. The crafting of an account, as Aristotle suggested, entails this complex interweaving of ideas and concepts and arguments and pre-existing materials that serve as evidence. So in the talk today, I've tried to suggest that we should avoid privileging either kind of proof, either the material inartistic facts or the artistic account that I offered. Inartistic proofs and materials are not epistemically superior to our narratives. It is, after all, the truth. The city streets of Syracuse and the 15th Ward could not speak for themselves. They do not have that capacity. But the hard work of community and student activists could craft their view. On the other hand, inartistic and proofs and materials are not just inert. This glass of water is not just nothing. It's part of my action of drinking. It would be weird if I did that without that. this has agency in the action. So too, in my account of memory, the very streets, the remnants, the shelled buildings, the empty lots, the photographs, these all had agency to call forth and craft the rhetorical account of their memory. Rhetorics of memory then, and I'll say especially traumatic past, must engage both the broken narrative and the remnants of those breaks. Or in other words, you must account for both the wound and the scar. Only by engaging in such an active process can a new account be formed that allows for healing and provide new ground for a hopefully more just